What are they booing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. So, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. Today we have with us Manu Bazzano from London, and I'm Ron Purser here in San Francisco. David?
Hi, I'm David Forbes. I'm in Brooklyn.
Great. And we will jump right into our very first interview on the Mindful Cranks. Welcome, Manu.
Thank you for having me.
We thought you have been such a prolific author with so many books that have come out over the years, as well as articles, that it would be sort of impractical to think we could cover all the bases here. But I thought before we get into some of your works that it might be nice to share with us a little bit of your background, perhaps your journey of how you discovered Buddhism and what drew you to it. That might be a good way to kind of just start out.
Yeah. Yes. When I was 21, I went to a Lam Rim Tibetan educational program. It was taught by Lama Yeshe, who founded a center, a monastery and meditation center in Tuscany. Mm-hmm. There was a brief encounter, and I was fairly kind of taken by the complexity, exoticism, but also by the good heart of this teacher, a wonderful teacher. And at the same time, I finished what was my first love, which was philosophy, particularly European philosophy, and particularly Nietzsche. As soon as I finished university, I went to India and spent several years traveling back and forth, having some interesting experience with a teacher called Osho. At the time I was so confused that Buddhism, Hinduism, the eclecticism of Osho was all the same to me. It was all Eastern, it was all something to do with meditating and contemplating and experiencing things. So it was a rather rich, interesting, but a little scattered attempt at understanding this mixture of Buddhism and Eastern practices. And then I had a spell doing music, playing rock music in a band. Music and poetry and literature was very important. So you could say I'm a kind of a failed rock star on one level. Which is, I think he had his blessing, the fact that I didn't succeed in that. And until I was continuing meditating with friends and being interested and doing the odd class, and until I got seriously into, in the early 90s to mid-90s, into Zen, the White Plum Sangha, which is a form of westernized, but essentially Japanese Buddhism. Maizumi, Taizan Maizumi was the main teacher. So I started to practice with a certain regularity to the point where I received the precepts and was ordained and continued to practice, and also to link in later years increasingly my study philosophy with Zen practice, to which I added the most recent form of training. I've done about 10 years ago. I finished psychotherapy training, and I started practicing as a psychotherapist and trainer myself. So the effort at the moment is bringing all these strands together: psychotherapy, Western psychotherapy, Zen Buddhism, the way I learned it and practice it, and Western, particularly European philosophy, and Nietzsche in particular. That's more or less It's an ongoing thing, and it's an attempt each time trying to get it right and failing, but in the process articulating my thoughts and also practicing with friends and being involved in discussions such as these this one, which helped me articulating it further.
This might be getting ahead of ourselves. I'd love to hear you talk about how you see the connection between your Zen practice and psychotherapy. If we think that, if some people would argue that psychotherapy is enhancing the self in the Western tradition, and that Buddhism we're questioning the nature of the self. How do you put the two together? How do you do that? That's a big question. I know you've thought about it, and I know you have an approach.
It's an excellent question, because I came from Zen first and then psychotherapy. It felt that with Zen I was on a jet plane. I was flying over the territory and having a sense of, on a good day, incredible freedom from the constraints of the self. And then usually, Monday morning, once the retreat is over, I was back to the usual dramas and tribulations of the self. So I felt that the danger there was what people like John Wellwood would refer to as spiritual bypass.
Yes.
And so my expectation with psychotherapy was that here was potentially an approach that, rather than fortifying the self, would look more closely at the nitty-gritty. So again, going over the same territory, but this time with a slow vehicle, even walking rather than a jet plane, and then combining the two. But generally speaking, the assumption that you mentioned is correct. And for that reason, maybe the two can be integrated. Mm-hmm. And also, but at the same time, it's also true that if you think of psychotherapy, there are so many strands, and they are moving and evolving as we speak. And there is an emphasis, less and less of an emphasis on the self as a solid construct, more of mental health, for lack of a better word, being akin to a certain acceptance of the natural fluidity of experience. And you see this in Rogers, for example, in the humanistic, in Carl Rogers, he would say, he would speak of a flowing river. So there are hints that maybe can help bridge these two dimensions. And I think one needs the other. I mean, I wouldn't make a grand general statement, but certainly in my own life, in the life of people I meet, there is a link there with one practice can help the other.
Yep.
Yeah, in fact, you have a new book that's coming out soon, Zen and Therapy, A Contemporary Perspective. Is this something you're going to elaborate on, and who's publishing that particular book?
Yes, that's will be published by Routledge. I am writing it as we speak. And it's still work in progress. But the main, what I was just saying, in a way, it's the backdrop. And I also like to be surprised. I'm not sure how it's going to look by the time it's finished. I have this general outline, but it's pretty much what I will try and articulate in a way that can be useful to others, I hope.
Let me ask you about that a bit more, because there's been some criticism about how perhaps some strands of Western Buddhism have been therapized, in other words, psychologized, to the extent that perhaps we may be having a different form of spiritual bypassing. I think that you actually mentioned in one of your articles in praise of stress reduction.
Stress induction.
Stress induction, yes, thank you. In praise of stress induction, Mindfulness Revisited, which was actually the first article that I read by you, and that's how I discovered your work. That came out in the European Journal of Psychotherapy and Counseling, I think, in 2013. But in that, you made an interesting point that you said that, yes, there's spiritual bypassing from a psychological perspective, but you also made the point that there may be some spiritual bypassing of groundlessness in the mindfulness movement. And I was wondering if you might elaborate on what you meant by that.
I would say mindfulness first as a secularist approach, and now increasingly is being proposed as a mainstream approach. My suspicion is that it's eventually both the self, and because I see a crisis in the self, the reason for which a person goes to a mindfulness program or to therapy or to a psychologist to receive some sort of help is because a crisis has opened up. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that that type of intervention help patch up, put together again Humpty Dumpty, and send it back to the assembly line, if you like. So, which in itself is a functional, useful thing, but is also taken out of a wider context, out of a wider ethical, mythical context, because what is missed in that is that the crisis could be also an opening. To use a cliche, a breakdown or a potential breakdown can become a breakthrough, an understanding that the crisis can be an opening to a more fluid, freer, more compassionate experience. And instead, what I found happening with the mainstream type of mindfulness is that Humpty Dumpty is put back together, and so the possibility of a real opening is missed, mm-hmm. Which is I think it's a shame. But then again, it's a very hard to sell, to propose something that almost encourages and values a crisis, because nobody wants to dwell in that. We want to be fixed, and I think the problem is that a reductive approach like mainstream mindfulness, as I see it, is a kind of a fix. I hope I'm answering you. To your question. Am I answering you?
Yes, I think so. And I think one of the questions about this notion of the self, as it's seen through, let's say, Western psychotherapy, or even for that matter, Western philosophy, is that when we use that frame to make sense of these mindfulness techniques, it's usually for some instrumental purpose or aim. In other words, the question is always, what's in it for me as the self, whether it's self-improvement, lower stress, well-being, better performance, whatever it may be. And I think that it seems like this notion of groundlessness or no self, one of the core, you should say, we could say insights of awakening, is somehow being bypassed I think others might argue against that, but certainly you come out of a psychotherapy field, so I'm sure that you've been observant of this.
Yeah, it's basically the idea of gain, and I think Zen practice, as I understand it, is that there is no reason why we practice.
Yeah,
there is no gain from practice, and this chimes very well with my earlier study in philosophy, where one of the notions of the sacred is no utilitarian purpose. It's a dimension of play. It's a dimension that I practice because I practice, not because I want to get something out of it. And to want to get something out of it that I can pocket or I can embellish the self or somehow cure it is besides the point. It might be that some healing, some greater or more wise, compassionate perspective might come up, but that's almost like a side effect. It seems like you say correctly, I think, there's too much emphasis on gain. What do I get out of this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think it reduces the whole scope of practice, and it's true also in psychotherapy. I don't think there is I mean, this might sound strange to some, but I don't think there is a purpose to psychotherapy. The presenting issue, the client comes with a particular stress, but in fact, often in good therapy, something else comes up, which is more a sort of exploration of an existential situation, and maybe the gaining of a different perspective, a different worldview, which comes as a surprise.
Yeah, I think I recall reading from one of your books. You made the distinction between psychotherapy and psychotechnics, I think is the term.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting distinction in the sense that one of the concerns and one of the issues that I've been thinking about, and I think David has as well, and it comes up in your work in different places, and I thought might be something worthy of exploring, and that's the idea that there seems to be some sort of fear of pathos or the passions in modern secular mindfulness. I think it might be difficult to go into detail about that, but there's a sense, at least I have, that the affective dimension is somehow seen as unruly, somehow needs to be managed. And this kind of brings to mind Foucault's care of the self and technologies of the self.
Mm-hmm.
I have a family friend who was an actor who passed several years ago, but I remember him telling me that one of his techniques to get into a particular role was to find the pathos, but not to step completely into it. And I found that to be an interesting. When I read about pathos in your work, that came to mind. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the issue here in terms of this sort of puritanical kind of thread or strand, and it seems to be coming perhaps more from modernized or Buddhist modernism, kind of the Buddhist modernist strand of Vipassana.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I'll try my best to answer. But there's something here about using psychology, using psychotherapy, using meditation in order to control and subdue what is considered threat, what can overwhelm the self, the magnificent monsters Nietzsche used to call them. So, but increasingly, good contemporary ethical philosophy, and I'm thinking of an American philosopher, Martin Nussbaum,
Chicago,
of the intelligence of emotions, the intelligence of passions, even so-called unruly passions. Passions, I'm talking about rage, lust, despair, fear. They have an inner movement, an inner intelligence. And the assumption is, I think, in the zeitgeist, in the dominant view at the moment, is that passions are somehow lower, animalistic, blind, and they have to be subjugated. And in the old days, we had religious forms of ascesis or asceticism, or other forms of denial of this element. And now we have a more modern, more shiny looking, more efficient looking, but equally puritanical way to approach them, in the hope that by doing enough meditation, enough yoga practices, enough weeks of mindfulness practice, I will be one day able to subjugate, or at least ride on this unruly part of human life. I think that's you could say it's a Promethean thing. And it's not just the mindfulness.
Right.
It's part of the dominant ethos at the moment. What is unruly has to be subjugated. And the problem was spelled out beautifully by Rollo May, existential psychoanalyst, American existential psychoanalyst, many years ago. He said absence of pathos, literally is apathy. Mm-hmm. No pathos, no life. So what is the hope? What is the hope there? That we will become detached and from our very roots of our very human roots. And this is pervasive. And it's also, there is in other circles, there is an increasingly attempt by other writers and friends to link a secular form of Buddhism to ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the Stoic, who speak of ataraxia, or serenity. But I think equally, what is forgotten there, that serenity cannot be achieved by bypassing the emotions.
Right.
And it would be a great loss. If you think everything, so many beautiful things in art, in literature, in human endeavor, somehow have to go through that and have to accept that element of the pathos. In fact, pathos originally means suffering.
Suffering, yeah.
Suffering.
I think there are two parallel tracks here in both Buddhism and psychotherapy. In terms of therapy, there's a kind of a trend of positive psychology, which in a way is ideological and wants to kind of minimize the full experience of feelings and of the so-called negative feelings. And in the way some secular Buddhism is used similarly, which I've written about recently, mindfulness is used for emotional regulation and for getting kids to deal better with their feelings. And so the positive, the healthier or the more wholesome or or closer to what you're suggesting in both realms. Good. We're both mental health professionals, so we know that good therapy, good counseling is you're with your feelings. You be with your feelings. You work with them. You work with them. You come to know them. You come to be friends with them, and you work through them. And similarly, parallel with good Buddhist meditation, my understanding is the same thing. You don't repress it. You don't you don't just notice it. You say, oh, there's anger out there, as if it's something you experience it. You work through it. You're literally using it and identifying with it, at least at the moment. And then at some point you let it go. You realize it's not you, or it's not permanent, or whatever. But there's two good parallels there with both good therapy and good use of mindfulness. But it's true. I think that there are cultural forms out there that are certainly don't want to deal with feelings and don't appreciate pathos in the best sense of how you described it.
Yes. And there's a point here about the root of some of these ideas. I mean, it could well be that early Buddhism, Vipassana, the Theravada, I don't want to make a generalization because there is a lot that is valid in this tradition.
Yes.
But it seems that the acceptance of passions and emotions and working with them, it belongs to, you could call it tantric Buddhism, but I also saw it experienced it in the Zen practice as well. And there seemed to be an emphasis in Vipassana from which strands of mindfulness derive of a different approach to passion, perhaps a more judgmental, maybe detached, and it's interesting that in the general perception in the culture, Buddhism is still this sort of rather either otherworldly or in a way
passive,
disdaining of human emotions. I blame it on Schopenhauer, who started this whole business in the 19th century by opening the gates of the West to Buddhism and seeing Buddhism as this sort of pessimistic, life is suffering, you have to go beyond, you have to leave the world, leave the passion, and so on.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunately still the perception out there. If you're a Buddhist, the assumption is that you are not living in the midst of the world. Somehow you have this sort of serene detachment from the blood, sweat, and tears of history. But I don't know. That's not true for me.
Yeah,
no,
I think
especially living in London.
Yeah, I've heard someone refer to as a stoic attentiveness. And it seems that the stoic attentiveness, that in a way, the way that mindfulness is being characterized, there's so much emphasis, or almost equating it with attention. And I'm thinking that perhaps there's some sort of assumption that consciousness or wakefulness is in control. To more of a degree than we actually are. I think that's hinting at kind of overrating the sense of the controller, the self as the manager that can manage so-called negative emotions. But that's interesting that you bring it up, because certainly I know you studied in the Zen tradition in Rinzai. Calmness and peacefulness is not necessarily at all what's going on in koan training. And Zen master Hakuin, of course, was notoriously known for his outburst and angry outbursts and shocking techniques. And as you mentioned with the Vajrayana in Tantra and Tibetan Buddhism, there are strains within that where the emotions are transmuted. So the anger can actually be transformed into clarity, and there's like awakened qualities of these emotions.
And I'm sure that there are historical reasons why this sort of Promethean control-driven Puritanism is dominant, because maybe there have been misunderstanding and misadventures in the with the way the Dharma has been coming to the West, with all sorts of shenanigans have happened.
Yeah, and coming.
So that is a reaction to that. But I think, the trouble is we are throwing away the baby with the bathwater and the very humanity of our experience.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, given that if we're importing a monastic practice that was actually designed for renunciants, who were fighting against their passions in many ways, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And that becomes the mainstream form of Western Buddhism and mindfulness. It seems like there's some sort of strange discord going on there of some kind. I can't quite put my finger on it, but maybe we should move on to talking about your long-time interest in Nietzsche. And you've written extensively about this. There's a book that came out called, that you authored, The Buddha is Dead. Nietzsche and the Dawn of European Zen. But that's just one among several other things that you've written. I'm wondering, why are you so intrigued with Nietzsche, and what relevance does he have to Western Buddhism? I know it's a big question.
We go. I mean, I am planning to. Well, no, let me just answer as clearly and straightforward as I can. I think when I first came across Nietzsche, I was very young. I sensed that he, almost by accident, came across an opening, an experience of groundlessness. Just by his meditation was walking. He would walk and walk and walk for 6-8 hours. It was also a way to be healthy, because he had a sickness. And so I sensed that he had achieved is not the right word, but come across an opening equal to what, or similar to what the Buddha had experienced under the Bodhi tree. Nietzsche experienced it by a lake in the Alps, by walking. And he tried most of his writing life to articulate this experience in the way it manifested. And I think the first thing is groundlessness. That not only there is no God, that God is dead is only the beginning of this. What God is dead means is that there is no, you could say there is no self, but also there is no abiding, guiding principle. There is nothing running the show, so to speak, running this whole circus of living and dying. And also that our species has been overrated in a sense, because we have moved, we like to believe that we have moved away from nature, from animals, from the wider existence, and that has been our problem. So I felt this from the beginning, and also the beauty of his writing, the humor, the strength of his writing. And I think his contribution here can be useful because if, as a Westerner, whether European, American, Australian, or whatever, I approach Buddhism without having deconstructed, dismantled some of the key principles of my own culture. So the background of Judeo-Christian ideas, morality, religion. If I haven't put aside or dismantled or at least questioned the basic assumption of Western thinking, I will approach Buddhism, I will project onto Buddhism, onto the Dharma, which is essentially other, different from the West. I will project Protestant notions, which I think is what happened, because it's mostly the version of Buddhism that are more popular are North American, North European. So Protestant, secularized, or religiously tinged Judeo-Christian notions of self, of morality, etc. So, but my hope is this, that if one is exposed to thinkers like Nietzsche, and there are other thinkers also can be very useful, then somebody like him, his writing will help dismantle this entire edifice that we've been building in the West for 2,000 years, which is centered around this notion of the subject, the belief in the existence of a self. And if we move from there, once that dismantling has happened, then we are able to approach it with less baggage.
That's a very interesting point. So even within our own Western philosophical tradition, we have sources like Nietzsche that could help us to truly Westernize Buddhism, is I think what you're saying.
Yes, and to capitalize on a way of thinking that has been present in the West, but it has been counter-traditional. It has been not part of the mainstream. And this is true also of American thinkers, South American thinkers, North American as well. So my question, I'm quite excited about this. What would Buddhism feel like? What would the Dharma practice and understanding be like if we approach it having learned the lessons of the counter-tradition, which started in the West, where Heraclitus so famously said, you can't step twice in the
same stream.
Yeah.
I mean, in that sentence, it's all in there. It's all in there.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to Nietzsche in a minute. That brings up the latest, another book that you've just recently edited, called Therapy in the Counter-Tradition, and with Julie Webb. And you make a really interesting point in the introduction, that it seems like we've lost this notion of philosophy as a way of life.
Yeah.
And instead, philosophy has sort of gone astray into language games and academic analytical philosophy and so forth. But I think what you're trying to do is retrieve this more life-affirming stance of philosophy. And this counter-tradition sounds like the path forward towards, as you just said, clearing the way for more of a Western foundation of Buddhism in the West.
Yes, and you said it very beautifully. It's that's the idea, and counter tradition has many strands because there is also you could say a spiritual religious element in there, and the example in the book is, for example, Pascal and also Kierkegaard. in the hands of these people, religion becomes something very exciting and very unsettling. Again, it's not. It doesn't go towards conformity. It doesn't go towards sanctifying and blessing injustice, iniquity in the world. But in fact, it's an invitation to question even more deeply.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings up a good point about maybe even clarifying if it's the counter tradition, what is the tradition that it's countering? I think that might be good to elaborate for the listeners.
Yeah. Well, the tradition, it starts with Plato, and it takes different forms. Essentially, it's this belief that behind this world of imperfect world of ours, of dukkha, of impermanence, of things not staying, things changing, things breaking up, an ephemeral world, that there is another world which is better, which is eternal, which we can aspire to, a more perfect, a more sane, a more fully formed world. So the general idea is that there is being behind becoming. Mm-hmm. So the tradition asserts the existence of a better ideal world that we will reach either in religion after death, or once we are fully therapized, or once we become 100% mindful and we will become so absolutely fully functioning human being. And so an ideal, a better world. And what characterizes this view is that already when you say that, you're saying this is not enough. This is not good enough. This living and dying, this unpredictable world that we are living, unpredictable life, impermanent life, is not good enough. And to me, that sounds like a denigration of life and death. And you find it in different forms. So this will take, there's the Plato, with the world of ideas, and then Christianity. But then you find it in Heidegger, with the idea of being having to be revealed, that we have forgotten being. There's this sense in the tradition that we have fallen from a state of grace, from a state of purity, of perfection. And what the counter tradition says in different forms is, this is it, but we haven't even begun to experience it. So before we start thinking about a more perfect, idealized world, let's try and explore the infinity of the world. So we'll never get to the end of it, of course. So another way to maybe describe this is that the tradition moves towards totality.
Totality.
Totality. So a sort of vertical view of reality, and the counter tradition moves towards infinity.
So in a way, you're saying that the tradition, as it moves towards totality, is also seeking complete certainty of some kind.
Yes, it is a nostalgia for certainty, and what a counter-traditional approach would be is more about certitude, a certain strength that, okay, I can do my best to face inherent uncertainty, but I'm not going to create a model, a system, whether an 8-week program or a system of philosophy that will grant me that, yes, I have a grasp about the reality, and I know I have the formula to make you happy. So it's a different, I don't know, I think for me at heart is a sort of recognition of my limitation as a human being, and nevertheless a desire to live more fully.
So would you characterize, let's say, scientific materialist views as moving towards the direction of totality? And in other words, it seems to me that even though we're talking about some otherworldly, transcendent impulse, on the other hand, there's still this notion that we can have this scientific utopia. We'll discover all the workings of neural circuitry, for example, and then be able to have master control over the sense of our own humanity. We'll be able to master it.
That's right. I mean, here the paradox is this, that the same narrative, or a similar narrative at least, runs through both scientific materialism and spiritualism. There is an assumption that, to give an example, there is a sort of a Christian view, spiritual Christian view behind Darwin's notion of evolution. There is a similar sort of Christian view in Hegel, and the problem is can we live without this compulsion to create a system, a method, a formula, a technique, because all of these are born out of fear. Can we live in the world without having to, without this knee-jerk reaction?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of knee-jerk reactions, I mean, maybe we can turn our attention to recent events. I mean, with the Paris bombings and Islamophobia, Donald Trump syndrome here in the U.S. Because one of the other books that you wrote, The Spectre of the Stranger, a phenomenology of hospitality, I think this is a very timely book, given the sort of almost neo-fascist rhetoric that we have going on here during the presidential campaign in the U.S. And world events. Can you say a little bit more about that book and what you were trying to do in that book?
Yeah, I will try. I think we go back to where we started in terms of the notion of the self. Let's say, put it this way, deep in my heart, I cannot accept the fact that I have contradictions in me, that I have, that what I call the self, my identity, may have some deep-seated contradiction. It might have, as we were talking about pathos, might have aspects that I don't like. So the typical thing I would do is to project this part of me somewhere and onto another person. So I would, in order to keep myself relatively consistent, I need to project this onto an enemy, onto a person, another that belongs to a different world, a different culture. So, I mean, famously, was it Hannah Siegel, a woman psychoanalyst, when the Cold War ended and with Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union collapsed, she said, this is a very critical time because we will have to manufacture an enemy.
Right, another other.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, and then the enemy, lo and behold, showed up. Mm-hmm. So the other represents, in psychology, would be simply the unwanted, disowned part of me. So it's in a way, it's a very important thing too. And but the problem is that in projecting that onto the other person and in battling the other, I reduce my ability to properly be a self. So let me say it more in a different way. I can only be me if I recognize and accept you. Recognize and accept doesn't have to mean lovey-dovey or it's all hunky-dory, but I am able to dialogue and confront our differences and speak openly. In the same way, I can only call myself a citizen, and I'm thinking of Hannah Arendt, who was saying something very similar. If I can dialogue, accept as fully human and fully intelligent, and the so-called non-citizen, so the person who is belonging to a different culture, or increasingly, what I focus on the book is the migrants. Mm. So if I cannot accept a migrant, then I'm, properly speaking, I'm not a citizen. I am, to use an old-fashioned word, a bourgeois. And the bourgeois is when I am a bourgeois the moment I only take care of my backyard or the members of my tribe, and also the moment I cannot accept that there are in me deep-seated contradictions, because the self, again, is a Humpty Dumpty. It's not a solid thing. So what I try to do in this book is to draw parallels between a very psychological encounter between me and you, and then on a political scale between citizen and migrant. So the migrant is also the receptacle, if that's the right word, of my worst fears. And now it has become, the notion that some of the terrorists in Paris may have come through the borders via Syria. I mean, that's a gift for the far right.
Right.
Here it is. The migrants. In the midst of the migrants hides the devil, the killer, the terrorist. So it's a very complex thing. But I think again, it's at the heart of it, it's fear. So I don't know if it's too high-minded or too exaggerated to think that somewhere I suspect there is a link here between what we call meditation, looking, being with what emerges, and realizing the fractured or fluid nature of what I call self. And then I think, can this experience be transposed to the political dimension where, what am I defending? What am I defending as an identity if I know that this notion of identity, supposedly threatened by migrants, is fictitious in the first place? And if I know that as an experience when I sit on the cushion, I suspect somewhere that this may be useful. But at the moment, the way we are now, meditation is something that the bourgeois does,
It's very privatized, yeah.
Privatized, in a moment of crisis.
Yeah, and I think they some of the secular mindfulness types oversell that. They think that by merely sitting on a cushion or merely teaching people to meditate, the political and cultural and social problems are going to eventually go away. It's all just personal, a bunch of personal selves doing it, and that's they're not looking at the larger issues here. They don't have a kind of analysis. They're not making these links.
Both of you, I mean, both Ron and David, but you said this very well in various things. You mentioned how this sort of technology, this sort of mind technologies are more from its ethical meaning. It's almost here's a technique, here's a little thing, get better and go back to do what you always do without ever questioning it.
Yeah. And again, I think also that good therapy, well, certainly individual private therapy is valuable and important and can help people work through, Freud's insight about projection is useful in many ways in therapy. I mean, you want to sit with and confront that part of your self that you're denying, you don't recognize it, you project it onto other people, and then to extend that model. I mean, I think it's almost like if the culture is a fear-based culture, or if people, or the economic system produces fear that they're going to take away my job, everybody's fearful and insecure, that we need more grown-up ways of bringing that to the culture and the society. It's almost like a way of healing, or again, I'm trying to be careful here not to reduce everything to just therapy or just healing, but there's a place for this. I mean, to look at it in terms of really what you're describing, in terms of having a less fear-based society.
Yes. And this is, I mean, social, it's political. I mean, therapy has unfortunately a rather narrow field. Yeah. But there's interesting things going on. I don't know in the U.S., but there is increasingly here a case for a more socially aware, politically active therapy.
Isn't there something like Psychotherapist Against Austerity over there in the UK?
There's an alliance, and there is a forum of counsellors and psychotherapists for social responsibilities. There is lots of things going on. It's a matter of, there's even a case for, therapists having a union, because you're often asked to uphold certain principles, but if you're also very exposed to this vagaries of the market, and it's a complex thing, and it's still a work in progress.
Well, very good. I think this might be a good point to thank you for participating in our first interview on the Mindful Cranks with Manu Bazzano.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.